Hello, YouTube divers. This is Water Dive 122, and I want to welcome you all to the second episode of the history of Western Carolina University. Last time we saw each other, we talked about the university's very early days under then President Robert Lee Madison, or at least the first era of him. I'll explain more about this later in the video, but we talked about all of the major events that happened between 1889, when the university was founded, up until the end of the Madison era in 1912. And this time, we're going to be talking about three different eras. We're going to be introducing three more presidents of Western Carolina University, or whatever it was called back in the day. We'll explain more about this in the video. We're going to be talking about the era. We're going to be talking about the Reynolds era. Um, we're going to be talking about the Hunter era, and we're going to be talking about the very first presidency of the very first Byrd era in this video. And occasionally, previous presidents might also pop up throughout the video here and there. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and jump right into the history. We're going to be talking. We're going to be talking about the Reynolds era, basically the era of Alonzo Carter Reynolds and his time as university president or college president at this time. So this era lasted from 1912 to 1920, but in this little segment, we're also going to talk about the brief return of President Madison. So, without further ado, let's get started. So, in 1912, Robert Lee Madison briefly stepped down as the school president, and Alonzo Carter Reynolds was selected as WCU's second ever president. The groundwork for expansion began immediately following his election. In 1913, a new building was constructed and it was named the Joyner Building. The building was named after the North Carolina State Superintendent of Education at the time and a member of the Cullowhee Normal and Industrial School Board of Trustees, J.Y. Joyner. The Joyner Building took the place of the old Madison Building in terms of being the center of attention around campus at the time. It hosted classrooms, literacy society rooms, a multi-purpose room, a book room, and a small library. In fact, before the current Hunter Library was constructed on campus in the late 50s, we'll talk more about this in the next video. Um, the Joyner Building, excuse me, was the primary library location on campus. President Reynolds also proposed to construct a new women's dormitory adjacent to Joyner in 1917. However, due to poor funding at the time, it delayed the project for another 6 years. Construction would not start until 1923. President Reynolds stepped down as university president in 1920, and former President Robert Lee Madison earned a second term and would oversee campus operations until 1923. 1923 in particular was a big year in terms of campus expansion. Cullowhee Normal and Industrial School gained two new buildings this year. A steam plant opened this year, but it didn't start fully functioning until 1924. And after many renovations, it remains the oldest building on Western Carolina's campus. And fun fact, it also uses the same steam whistle that was used way back in its infancy years. So that's a little fun fact, as well as the fact that it blows at noon every weekday to to signal out the change of shifts at the steam plant. A training school was also finished in 1923, and students at CNIS would use this building to help them practice their teaching skills. As far as I can tell, this building never really gained a name. I'd just like to think that it was just known as the CNIS Teacher Training School. Um, and then finally, the plan to build the aforementioned women's dormitory that was originally proposed by President Reynolds in 1917 finally had been approved to build. State Senator and Board of Trustees member Walter E. Moore was an instrumental figure in helping the funding process of this dormitory. Once the building was complete in 1924, it was named in Moore's honor. Hence, now we got the Moore Building. President Madison officially stepped down from the university president in 1923, and Hiram T. Hunter is selected the new president of Cullowhee Normal and Industrial School. Now, with that said, let's move on to the Hunter era. This is going to be a long era as he was president from 1923 all the way up to 1947. So 2.5 decades of being president of this school. So let's talk about it. So the Hunter era officially begins with the aforementioned completion of the Moore Dormitory, as it was known back then, in 1924. It hosted over 180 female residents and was the school's primary dining hall until 1957, and we'll talk more about that in the next video. Monthly public tea times would be hosted at Moore's front parlor, where the women would be taught how to be gracious hostesses. A statue of Little Caesar was also donated to the school and was put on display in front of the Moore building for many years. And again, there was a major event that took place at the Moore building, and it involved this statue. It was stolen in the 60s by Appalachian State Teachers College. And even though it was returned, it was heavily vandalized. I might also touch on that again in the next video when we talk about the 50s and 60s. Moore was also home to some rather dark history. 3 very horrifying tragedies took place on the top floor, or the 3rd floor, of this building. And the first of these tragedies occurred in the 1920s. And if you go to Western Carolina University these days, or if you work at Western Carolina University, you're definitely somewhat aware of these stories. So the first story, as I said, happened in the 20s, and the legend states that 2 of the residents decided to stay on campus over a break, and one of them decided to go take a shower. She's gone for an abnormally long time. Before the roommate could leave the room to go check on her, scratches were heard on their door. The roommate screams in fear and backs away from the door, and a man standing outside calls up to her asking if everything is all right. He warns the roommate not to leave the room, and a few minutes later, the roommate finds the girl dead in a pool of her own blood with her throat slit. And as I said, current WCU students and employees will tell you that this victim's ghost continues to haunt Moore to this very day, as Moore is one of the oldest buildings on campus to this very day. It's not used anymore. We'll talk more in depth about that in another video, but needless to say, Moore's been shut down for a few years. It's not used for anything at this current state. And legend says that the ghosts of these victims still haunt Moore to this very day. And as I said, we'll talk more in depth about this in another video. The school went through another name change, officially renaming the campus to Cullowhee Normal School in 1925. However, this name did not last very long, as in 1929, 4 years later, it was renamed again, this time to Western Carolina Teachers College, or WCTC for short. Also this year, the school purchased the land that once hosted the Mount Zion AME Zion Church and began plans to build a new dormitory on the land. After 3 years of negotiation, I'm assuming this took place in 1926, because I've read that the building was actually completed in 29. So I guess propositions were propositions and negotiations started in 26, but neither here nor there. After 3 years of negotiation, the church agreed to move to their location on Old Cullowhee Road, which you could still go to that church and see it up until this very day. As for the new dorm, it was completed in 1930 and was named after another Board of Trustees member, Reuben B. Robertson. It officially saw its first residents in 1931 and is one of the oldest remaining active dormitories on the campus to this very day. During the Great Depression, U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt signed what is now known as the New Deal. The New Deal helped create new jobs and repair the struggling economy following the Depression. The largest New Deal agency was the Works Progress Administration, and I bring them up because they helped out with the construction of public roads and other assorted projects across the U.S., and were also instrumental in helping the funding process of many of the current buildings you see on Western Carolina's campus to this very day, including the Breese Gymnasium. In 1931, WCTC began to field a football team and were known as the WCTC Catamounts starting in 1933. To this very day, Western Carolina University is one of only two American universities, the other being the University of Vermont, who has their mascot as a catamount. In 1937, construction that was funded by the WPA began on the campus's first gymnasium, the aforementioned Breese Gymnasium, named after yet another Board of Trustees member, William E. Breese. And spoiler alert, many of the buildings that were named at this time were named after school Board of Trustees members, so just know that. The gymnasium was officially completed in 1939 and had a basketball court, indoor swimming pool, showers, offices, and 2 classrooms. Breese is another historic building that is still active to this very day and is currently the home of the university's dance program. 1939 was an absolutely huge year for expansion. Many new buildings were opened this year, so let's go by them one by one. Graham Infirmary opened this year and was named after Frank Porter Graham, a former World War I Marine Corps soldier and a teacher. He was also the president of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill from 1930 to 1949. Graham Infirmary became the primary medical clinic on WCTC's campus until the Byrd Building was completed later on. An auditorium was completed this year and was named after Clyde R. Hoey, North Carolina's governor at the time. The building featured a 900-seat capacity music hall and had classrooms, practice rooms, and studios for the School of Music. And it was another building that still stands to this very day, and it currently holds productions from the School of Stage and Screening, as well as possibly the theater program here at Western. I'm not 100% sure, but I'd like to think that the auditorium regularly hosts theater productions. So there's that. And then the McKee Building also opened this year and was the first building on WCTC's campus to be named after a woman. The building is named after Gertrude Dills McKee, North Carolina's very first female senator, and yet another member of the school's Board of Trustees. The McKee Building still hosts classes up until this very day, housing the school's anthropology, world languages, history, Cherokee studies, and sociology departments. Much of its original woodwork is still used, and legend states that tunnels that were dug by the Nunahai, I believe that's how you pronounce it, or otherwise known as Cherokee Little People, were founded underneath the building. The campus also gained a new dormitory this year with the opening of the Madison Dormitory. This replaced the old Madison building that was opened in 1904 and started off as a women's dormitory. Currently speaking, Madison mainly hosts graduate students who attend WCU, and is also named after the university's first ever president, Robert Lee Madison. Um, and then the final building that was opened in 1939 was the Old Student Union, located adjacent to Moore and Joyner. Another building that was funded by the Public Works Administration. The Old Student Union hosted the celebration of the school's 50th anniversary and featured speeches from the aforementioned Frank Porter Graham and a political science professor, women's rights activist, and presidential appointee from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, Ms. Harriet Elliott. These days, the Old Student Union serves as the headquarters for WWCU, the campus's primary radio station. As World War II rages on in Europe, male enrollment on campus drops by 10%, and WCTC's student body lost 26 men in the war. One of those men happened to be the significant other of another victim of the infamous tragedies at the Moore dormitory. When the victim found out that her partner was killed in the war, she became so distraught to the point where she took her own life by hanging herself. Legend says that her ghost also haunts the third floor, or the top floor, of the Moore building, much like the victim from the 20s currently does. In 1946, a small town was constructed to house married students who had their partners fight in World War II. This place would be known as Boodleville, and and it stood where the current Albright and Benton dormitories stand today. An alumni house was built in 1940 and was the housing unit for Dean Ernest Byrd. And later on, it would be opened for guests. President Hunter stepped down from the role as WCTC's president in 1947, and the aforementioned Ernest Byrd took over. President Hunter's era is very much remembered for all of these, and for the massive expansion and the of the not just new construction of buildings on campus, but also expansion of student body as well as program availability. During his presidency, during the Hunter era, the campus went from a two-year college, to now a four-year institution, as it currently is today. Um, and Yeah, it was just a very long and eventful presidency, and so much happened during his time as president. It was a really fun era to research and discover. It's great. Now let's talk about the first presidency of William Ernest Byrd. So, William Ernest Byrd was a 1915 alumni from the Cullowhee Normal and Industrial School, and first became president in 1947, taking over the long and eventful reign of President Hiram T. Hunter, as previously mentioned. However, unlike the Hunter era, Byrd's presidency didn't have many major events, as Byrd was only president from 1947 to 1949, or at least in this first term, anyway. However, there were four notable events that took place during the tail end of his first presidency. A restaurant opened in 1949 and quickly became the main center for student socialization. This was known as the Townhouse Restaurant, and it featured a sandwich shop and an ice cream fountain. These days, it's now a location for the ever-growing fast food chain Subway. WCTC's first ever bookstore opened around this time as well, and was located in the Joyner building. This continued to build up the popularity of Joyner among students, as many WCU students will, way back, many WCU alumni will tell you Joyner was just such a great place and a very beloved place on campus. WCTC also opened a new football stadium in 1949, simply known as Memorial Stadium. Between 1931 and 1949, Western Carolina University would use an athletic field where the current Stillwell building now stands. And honestly, Memorial Stadium wasn't too far from where the original field was. In fact, if you've been on WCU's campus, Memorial Stadium was where the current Apodaca building currently stands. So there's that. Memorial Stadium would host football games on campus over the course of the next 2.5 decades until the current E.J. Whitmire Stadium was completed in the mid '70s. But we'll discuss more about that later, in another video rather. The campus's first radio station was also founded in 1948 and was known as WWOO and was founded by many World War II veterans. And with that said, William Ernest Burns stepped down as president in 1949, and Paul Apperson Reed took over as the succeeding president. And much like the Hunter era, Reed's presidency was massive. There was a lot of There was a lot of expansion. There were a lot of major events during the Reed era, but we will talk about that in the next video. So, thank you so much for watching, my fellow YouTube divers. This is WaterDive 122 signing out, ready to dive into more fun on YouTube. Thanks for watching.